my dear Bagginses and Boffins.
Of appendices at the end of The Return of the King. As Vanity Fair states, while Jackson is not connected to the project, his movies, as well as their spiritual successor Game of Thrones, proved that there's a massive audience for, and this is the key word here, immersive fantasy. Of course, many have tried to capture that same audience, and few have survived or thrived. You want to know why? Well, it's that word immersive. You can't have immersive fantasy when you're trying to, as the showrunners state, reflect today's world. It felt only natural to us.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll do this point, and we'll see if we have time. Otherwise, we might wrap this particular section up here. This is sort of what I was getting at with a previous comment that he made when people are watching fantasy movies and shows. It's really hard to get people to suspend their disbelief. And I think that's ultimately why we didn't see very many fantasy movies up until Lord of the Rings came out, because it's so hard to do it in a serious manner, knowing that you have a bunch of fictional races and creatures running around, and to get people to actually care and to believe that this is happening. There's a lot of work there for the writers and the actors and the director. And so this is where the race comes in. He's hinting at it here in terms of they want this show to reflect the current social, political climate of the day. And so this is one where, again, it's hard really to figure out how best to tackle it, because on the one hand, I do sympathize with people who just enjoy Peter Jackson's original trilogy, which does veer off from the books, as we've talked about before, but the underlying principles and ideas of many characters, not all. Aragorn is a key character that is completely changed, but many of them are still true to some degree, or at least recognizable. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, is for, especially for hardcore fans. New fans, it won't matter, right? For new fans, this is nothing. This is, you will learn these characters' names and you'll get to know them, and you'll have no preconceived notions. You'll have nothing to reference them to. But for fans of the Peter Jackson's trilogy that are going to be bringing a lot of that with them, a lot of that baggage, for us to be immersed, we do need to feel some sort of continuity there. And I think that's where the problem is going to be, specifically for me, it's specifically for the hobbits. But I think a lot of people, it's specifically for the elves. I think you and I have both covered the dwarves. We're both okay with that. And I think a lot of people are okay with the dwarves. That kind of makes sense why you might have a multicultural dwarven society. But when it comes to the elves, it has been stated by Tolkien, and it's pretty clear what the races of those fantasy races are. But I do have something I want to talk to you about in reference to that. So, a quick backstory. I don't know if you want to add anything before I go on this kind of tangent about race relations in...
Well, I was just gonna say that the Witcher had black elves and they had dwarven women with beards.
Yes, yeah. So I did want to touch on that too. That I have, if you've seen any of our previous videos, I was a bit more leaning towards I prefer the dwarven women with beards. I've since kind of come around and said, you know, if you're gonna have different cultures of dwarves, maybe they have different standards. But I think it's such a small thing that I'm just surprised they didn't include it, especially since The Witcher did include it. In regards to the elves, just a couple things real quick, but they're all interconnected. So with regard to the elves, Dungeons and Dragons, which is the fantasy game that is largely based on Tolkien's work, even though Tolkien didn't really like Dungeons and Dragons, that doesn't matter. It's based on it, and a lot of nerds, should I say, quote unquote, such as we're watching Nerdrotic, at least know of Dungeons and Dragons and can recognize the characters within it if they were to come to life in another medium, aka The Witcher, aka Lord of the Rings, The Wheel of Time, anything. And there are multicultural versions of all of the characters. There are darker elves that belong to a different group of elves that have splintered off. Sometimes they're the dark elves, sometimes there's night elves, there's elves that live underground. So there's a whole bunch of versions of these races within that realm, which is largely based on Lord of the Rings. And so there potentially is bringing some of that creativity to light here. And so what people are going to say is, well, that's not how Tolkien saw it. But here's my counter to that I have been looking at all weekend, basically, which is this. Tolkien wrote these books, The Hobbit and the original trilogy, as if he himself were transcribing them from a previous writer who wrote in a different language, which is why we have a lot of this fun language stuff going on in his works. And that previous writer is Bilbo and Frodo.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we might have here is a case of an unreliable narrator. I know a lot of people have spent a long time reading these books and trying to decipher every little thing, but we are reading books written by two hobbits who, before they went on adventures, knew nothing of the outside world. And so when a hobbit writes in a book claiming that he has met some dwarves and all the women dwarves he met had beards, that does not necessarily mean all dwarf women have beards. It means Bilbo and or Frodo, depending on who's writing the book, depending on which book you're referencing, may not have met all the dwarves and all the groups of dwarves. In fact, we know Frodo didn't. Frodo met very few. So really, we're only going based on Bilbo's account of what dwarves would look like. And he only met a group of dwarves that were trying to get back to get their mountain back from a dragon.
Yeah.
He didn't meet the dwarves from other mountain clans because those dwarves, as we learn in The Hobbit, chose not to partake in this adventure because they still feared the dragon. And so I know people are going to really hate that explanation potentially, but I think it's one worth looking at because Tolkien has stated multiple times the way he writes these books is as if he is translating them from an ancient group of people, in this case hobbits, that inhabited England before humans. And so there is a lot that could have been happening that these writers of history, as we know from real life history, just simply didn't know about. And to me, that is a perfectly satisfactory answer to why we might be surprised by new groups of dwarves or elves or even hobbits. The hobbits one is harder because you would think, unless there's a hobbit group from another completely different part of Middle-earth, it would be hard for hobbits to slip past that. I think we'll touch on it in this one, but just in case not, I want to quickly reference it here. There's a line that talks about the Harfoots being slightly darker skin, and so in the Amazon show, there's going to be a full-on black hobbit, at least one, maybe more. And some people are criticizing that, saying that the line is darker, so it would be more like a tanned hobbit who works more out in the sun. But to me, I don't really care about that too much. To me, that's fine. I'm able to suspend my disbelief for that. Some people maybe not. But in terms of answering why the elves might be different colors or dwarves, the fact is we are getting these first-hand accounts and then second-hand accounts, since it's Tolkien who is pretending to be, well, he is a writer, but he's pretending to be a writer translating a document. We're getting their interpretations of it. So we don't have all the facts. I want to know what you think about that answer, because I know some people are going to be upset that essentially that means you can't trust a lot of what you read in the books.
I hadn't even thought of that. So it's a very new thing for me to think about.
Well, I mean, so the way I got to it is this is a way that George R. R. Martin writes. So he uses a lot of unreliable narrator where he will write something in a way in which you are getting pieces of it, but you know that there's more to the story, or sometimes you know that it's a completely fictional story, and then you get some dramatic irony, such as knowing that the Stark boys are not dead, for example. So that's dramatic irony where we know that Theon didn't kill them, and yet a lot of characters within the story know it. But there's other times where we're hearing these firsthand accounts of things, and we know that those characters might not actually know what they saw, or what, like, we're hearing it from someone who heard it from someone, and so the truth is different from what is being told to our characters. So I really enjoy that writing style. I think it allows readers, especially really, really diligent readers, to discover a mystery. And I know that's not in the books here. These books are written more of a history. But as we know from real world history, sometimes things are just not true from people who wrote the histories, because they just either didn't know or flat out lied. And in this case, we're getting the accounts from hobbits. And we know hobbits don't know. They tell us that all the time, that they have very little connection with the outside world. And so for them to then make these grandiose claims that all elves are white or all dwarven women have beards, it's coming from a place of ignorance, unfortunately, from these hobbits, because they truly have no reason to know that unless they sat down with Gandalf and talked about it.
Exactly. Nah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to kind of leave off with that sentiment, and I'm actually curious for people to comment down below, because I do know some people are going to have a hard time with that, but for me, that makes me think of it in a bit more of a fonder way, because it does feel a little bit more real than knowing that this is how real history is done. Sometimes things are just wrong, and we find out later. So yeah, let us know in the comments down below if that is a satisfactory answer to you. Remember to like and subscribe for our next installment, because we are going to be going through this entire video from Nerdrotic. So I'll see you next time.
I regret to announce this is the end. I bid you all a very fond farewell.